Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn on Advocacy Amid Crisis. Our speaker today is Michael Kebede, Policy Counsel for the ACLU of Maine. Michael will reflect on the relationships between policy advocacy, social movements, and political upheavals, and explore the reckoning that mass movements are currently roiling America have meant for established advocacy groups like MCV and the ACLU. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Director of Policy and Partnerships at Maine Conservation Voters, Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations work to protect Maine's environment and our democracy by building diverse coalitions, influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today's event. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. You can send your questions to me, Kathleen, through the chat as they occur to you. And you can find that chat by hovering your mouse over the bottom of the screen. I'll keep track of all the questions and we'll ask them during the Q&A session at the end. If you have any technical difficulties during the program, please message Will Sedlak through the chat function and he can help you out. The webinar is being recorded and we'll share a link to the video later this afternoon. We will also post it on our website where you can find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns as well. Thanks so much for joining us, and Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Will, for all the behind-the-scenes organization that made this event possible. Thank you to everyone who is tuning in now and who will listen to this video, which apparently will be immortalized on MCV's website. I will share a PowerPoint. Great. Okay, so I've titled my talk Advocacy Amid Crisis, and soon you'll notice how the title is slightly insincere. One of the takeaways from this talk, I hope, is going to be that we're always in crisis, and so advocacy in crisis is advocacy all the time. I will divide my talk into 4 sections. First, I'll talk about crisis and social movements, and then I'll describe an important through line that connects national and local social movements, which is Black radical feminism. Then I'll describe the ACLU's response and the response of Maine municipalities to the movement currently shaking the United States. And then I will try and distill some takeaways for allies, advocates, members of groups like MCV and ACLU. These views are entirely mine. The ACLU is a national bureaucracy with 2,000 staff members that takes a slow and deliberative approach to reaching conclusions. And definitely the conclusions in this presentation are entirely mine and didn't go through the ACLU's approval process. So a bit about myself. I was raised in East Africa, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And relevant to current times is my earliest political experience. In 2015, I was in high school when elections that were free and fair, right up to the point when results were announced, turned violent after the incumbent announced winning 98% of the vote. And the state, mass protests followed, and then the state responded with mass violence and mass imprisonment. Even though that was one of the formative early political experiences I had in Ethiopia, my day-to-day experience in this country versus in that country can just constantly underline for me how much more integrated violence is in this society than in that one. And I think a lot of that is to do with its policing culture, its prison culture, its surveillance culture, but especially its history and its foundations in the United States. Okay, so the United States, as I just alluded to, has been in crisis for hundreds of years, even before it became the United States. This is a quote from one of my favorite history books. It's right about page 40. And it's a very important, I think, debunking of how it came to be that Maine, formerly Massachusetts, formerly the Mass Bay Colony, came to be. Roxanne Dunbar Oritz writes, by the time Spain, Portugal, and Britain arrived to colonize the Americas, their methods of eradicating peoples or forcing them into dependency and servitude were ingrained, streamlined, and effective. If disease could have done the job, it's not clear why the European colonizers in America found it necessary to carry out unrelenting wars against indigenous communities, nearly 300 years of colonial warfare. Now, many of you will have heard of events that various historians have referred to as the Great Dying, from 1616 to 1619, up to 90% of the inhabitants of coastal New England were wiped out by a plague brought over by English settlers. In the 1630s, smallpox wiped out the 25%, roughly, of the people who remained. That's true, but there was also centuries of warfare and broken treaties that structures the relationship between this settler society and indigenous peoples. Slavery is also an important foundation for not just the country, but this state. As you all probably know, Nathaniel Gordon is the only person that the government has ever executed for the crime of selling people into slavery. He was from a prominent Portland family, from a prominent Maine family. And the Maine jury that stood in judgment of him actually acquitted him. It was an appellate court that found him guilty. Many prominent Maine and Portland families, including the owner of the famous Victoria Mansion, which is not too far from where I live here in Portland, owned slaves. And so, genocide and slavery, very important part, not just of the country's past, but its cultural present. But these crises, I'm going to continue to argue throughout the talk, have always spurred social movements. And as a result of these social movements, slavery ended. The abolitionist movement ended slavery. The suffragist movement gave us the women's vote. Civil rights movement started to ensure that Black women and Black people could vote. The labor movement turned FDR into the labor president. The anti-poverty movement turned LBJ into the anti-poverty movement. The environmental movement turned Nixon, a Republican, into probably the most effective environmental president in US history, and on and on and on. So we're in the middle of such a movement right now. If you've been living under a rock for the last 6 months, you might not know this, but I'm sure you've talked about it, thought about it, read about this. But the Black Lives Matter movement, by the New York Times' measure, is probably the largest in US history in terms of the numbers of people that have filled streets. It is in the experience of people, even in the civil rights movement, people like Angela Davis and others who were involved in the 60s and 70s in mass protests, much larger than even those, and much more multiracial and cross-class than even those movements. There's a narrative in the media about these movements being spontaneous, that George Floyd video goes viral, people fill the streets. That's only half true. A big part of the story is the intentional, years-long and careful organizing by many organizers throughout the country, probably the most prominent of whom are these three founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. You've probably heard their names, but if not, Patrice Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza. In 2013, they made the Black Lives Matter slogan go viral and founded the Black Lives Matter organization, and did it on the basis of not just advocating for people who are Black, but emphasizing the violence that people who are queer, trans, disabled, undocumented, with criminal records, women, face. And that is somewhat of a departure from the organizational culture and from the political ideology of the civil rights movement. One distinction I'd like to emphasize is the distinction between Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. So Black Lives Matter is the organization founded by these three organizers who were on the previous slide. The movement for Black Lives is a coalition of dozens of Black-led racial justice organizations, which includes Black Lives Matter. But after 2016, the movement for Black Lives decided to frame prisons and police as central to the country's history of anti-Blackness. And it published what it called its vision for Black lives. And in that vision for Black lives, it put forward a 7-part political platform. I strongly urge you to go and read this platform. I find it to be extremely informative, very well written, and applicable to almost every level of government in the United States. It's a treasure trove of political ideas. And if you're part of a protest and you're looking for demands, it's a great place to get them. The Defund Police slogan was popularized by the movement for Black Lives. As I said, Black Lives Matter is part of the movement for Black Lives, but many other organizations which predate Black Lives Matter are also part of this coalition. The movement for Black Lives has a local iteration. It has a local iteration that stretches far before the lives of any of us at this talk. I mean, Black radicalism in Maine stretches back to the founding of the state. Some early 20th century names are, for instance, there was a writer born in Portland, Black woman named Pauline Hopkins. She is, probably widely forgotten, not much read, but in her time, extremely influential in the first decade of the 20th century, extremely influential Black radical and thinker. But 4 years ago, there were Black Lives Matter protests that didn't generate as much attendance, but resulted in the arrests of 18 people. And the people were largely women, queer people, Black people, Muslims, immigrants, and their white allies. And if you read articles from back then about who was arrested and compare them to today, with articles about who's organizing Black Lives Matter protests throughout Maine, you notice a very strong continuity. And so this is another rebuke to the notion that protests are spontaneous. They just result from these viral videos. There's always an ideological, an institutional, and a personnel continuity from the past to the present. Over the summer, as I said in one of the first slides, the United States experienced the largest mass protests probably in its history, and Portland wasn't an exception. You see here pictured an organizer from the group in Portland that initially was named BLM Portland and then changed its name to Black Portland Organizers Working to End Racism. They organized a very large protest, released a raft of demands, and have dramatically changed local politics in Portland. The through line from the national movement for Black Lives to the local movement for Black Lives is what other scholars have called Black radical feminism. These are some of my favorite classics in the genre. It's an intellectual tradition that includes many, 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 many different types of voices, but these are some of my favorites. If you Google this, you'll get lots of books. One thing you find Black radical feminists doing is advocating in a way that creates a rising tide that lifts all boats. Historically in this country, Black femmes have advocated for everyone, while generally speaking, everyone has not fought for Black femmes. One of my favorite Black radical feminist organizers and movement builders in this country is Ella Baker. She's often found, when you study the 60s and 70s, at the intersection of movements like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and the communist movement, socialist movement. She was extremely effective at bringing together people from different walks of life, different parts of the movement, different political ideologies. She shunned the spotlight. This is a quote from the back of the book that's in the corner of this screen. She shunned the spotlight in favor of vital behind-the-scenes work that helped power the Black freedom struggle. You know, when the 60s are described, often the names that come up are charismatic Black men, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, Huey Newton, so on and so on and so on. But Ella Baker probably did more to bring organizations and movements together than any of these people. There's also an institutional structure of Black radical feminists and abolitionists right now, not just an ideological and academic structure. And the institutional structure includes these organizations I've decided to highlight, but dozens and dozens of others as well. The first is Critical Resistance. The second is National Conference of Black Lawyers. And the third is the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. So Critical Resistance was founded in the late 90s by Black radical feminists like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Angela Davis, and others. And they've always had an abolitionist perspective, which from their standpoint means not getting rid of prisons and police today and doing nothing to solve the problems these institutions purportedly exist to solve, but always working to build a world that doesn't require prisons, police, and surveillance. So that's Critical Resistance. And it's a very, very important precursor to this national movement right now. National Conference of Black Lawyers represents Black activists, Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, Attica Brothers, and on and on and on. And then the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, basically a policy outfit in California, works to lobby officials to shift resources away from prisons and punishment and towards funding destinations that make communities safe, healthy, and strong. And so while Critical Resistance tries to build a movement, and the National Conference represents controversial figures, the Ella Baker Center works on policy changes. And all of those came together in the National Movement for Black Lives. I'll skip that slide unless I get a question later. Okay. Everyone I know over the last 6 months has been talking about the meaning of this term, defund police. It's a very, very, very controversial term, but I think it reflects the strategic insight of these movement leaders and movement builders. And the word that explains exactly how insightful in terms of tactics and strategy these movement builders are is the term cathexis. It's not a term you hear very often. And since you came to a talk, I figure I'll use these arcane terms so that you can at least say, oh, I learned about cathexis, provided that you didn't know before. But cathexis is a term that political psychologists have used for decades to describe the concentration of mental energy on a particular person, idea, or object. And often it results from someone dangling a taboo in front of you. It's a marketing tool that is used by everyone from fascists to anti-racist and socialist activists. And it's extremely important because you change the Overton window and you change the narrative. You just make everyone talk about the thing you want to make everyone talk about. Defund Police does just that. It smashes the taboo of an institution that decades of pro-police culture, what some call propaganda, has made sacred. And it dangles the taboo of an anarchic society before your mind's eye. And so you see defund police and you just can't help but looking. You know, it's kind of like driving down the highway and seeing a burning car or a car, you just can't help looking. And that reflects the kind of strategic insight that advocacy groups such as the ACLU have, you know, attempted, but lacked for a decade. I mean, for a century. So how have states like Maine and groups like the ACLU responded to Black Lives Matter. I have here a quote from a UCLA professor. Robin Kelly wrote Freedom Dreams, but this is so Robin Kelly writes, "What are today's young activists dreaming about? We know what they're fighting against, but what are they fighting for? These are crucial questions for the most powerful. Visionary dreams of a new society don't come from little think tanks of smart people or out of the atomized individualistic world of consumer capitalism, where raging against the status quo is simply the hip thing to do. Revolutionary dreams erupt out of political engagement. Collective social movements are incubators of new knowledge." The summer was a reckoning for the country, but it was especially a reckoning for groups like ours who've been fighting surveillance and the police state for a long, long time. Our executive director basically did an about face on strategy and on the ACLU's guiding light as a result of the popularization of this slogan of defund police. So he said in a TED Talk and wrote in an article, "We don't need another training program on racial bias or implicit bias in police departments. We don't need to file another lawsuit on qualified immunity. We don't need to bring another race discrimination or gender discrimination lawsuit to integrate the police department. We need to defund the budgets of these police departments. It's the only way we're going to take power back. Defund police is going to be my North Star going forward." That's the executive director of the National ACLU. And he hastened to say, "We will advocate for training programs on racial bias. We will file lawsuits on qualified immunity. We will bring race discrimination and gender discrimination lawsuits, but those won't be our foremost priorities. Our foremost priorities will be what the Movement for Black Lives has made the cornerstone of its national advocacy strategy, defund police." Maine has also been completely shattered in its political direction, political culture over the last 6 months. So when I joined the ACLU last fall, one of the first things that I advocated for was police-free schools. And it wasn't just an uphill battle. It seemed completely impossible, dead in the water. And we considered it a victory when we prevented Portland schools, we helped prevent Portland schools police from wearing body cameras. Now, there wasn't a significant change in the composition of the school board between last fall and this summer. And yet, by a vote of 7-2, Portland got rid of all of its school police. Lewiston, by a 5-4 vote, got rid of one of its 4 school police and replaced that person with a restorative justice coordinator. Portland city councilors, whom I personally lobbied last year to pass Councillor Ali's proposal to ban facial recognition, decided to move forward with that ban this August. There was no election that changed the city council. And yet, as a result of there being a mass movement, they did these things. These things happened. We tried to make these things happen. It didn't work. And then with the tailwind of the movement for Black Lives, they fell like dominoes, whereas initially they felt like immovable mountains. Maine has also responded by scrutinizing what police do. And municipalities have done this, and the state legislature has done this. And so over the summer, Portland city councilors requested a workshop on what cops do. How many calls do they get? How do they respond? Exactly how many calls result in arrests? How many calls result in a use of force? And so this is a screenshot that I took from one of those workshops. That's Chief Clark of the Portland Police. And I personally learned information that blew my mind. Over the last 5 years, Portland Police received 80 to 85,000 calls a year. Every year, they carried out, between 2,000 and 2,500 arrests. Of the arrests, roughly 75 to 150 involved a use of force. In percentage terms, roughly 0.1 to 0.2% of 911 calls resulted in a use of force. Now, what that tells you is there's a huge misallocation of resources happening, because the police are the only state employees who are legally allowed to use force. And yet only 0.1 to 0.2% of the calls that we make to them involve a use of force. And so what's going on? Why are we throwing this much money at an institution that is doing what it's legally allowed to do, the thing that makes it exceptional, less than 0.5% of the time, less than 0.25% of the time that it's invoked? And so residents of Rockland is not exactly the revolutionary center of northern New England or the Western Hemisphere. And yet its residents decided to circulate a petition to defund police. I like Rockland. I think it's very pretty, nice food, nice art galleries. I recommend you visit. But its residents are circulating a petition to defund police. This is something I wouldn't have believed would happen if someone had told me it would happen just a year ago. But it did happen. And this is also, I had never thought to ask exactly what percent of police's work involves a use of force, and what's their day-to-day. Despite the fact that a lot of my job is to curb excessive uses of force by police and to expand civil liberties and protect individual rights for people who interact with the state here and elsewhere. And so this is all thanks to the national movement. Okay, this is the final part of my presentation where I'm gonna describe some takeaways. This is a quote from an article in a book that was pictured in the previous slide from one of my favorite writers. Her name is Audre Lorde. She wrote in an article titled Learning from the 60s, where she tried to distill lessons from the 1960s, a period she lived through, and during which she was an activist. She said that the 60s were characterized by a heady belief in instantaneous solutions, and that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. Our struggles are particular, but we are not alone. Within each of us, there's some piece of humanness that knows we are not being served by the machine which orchestrates crisis after crisis and is grinding all our futures into dust. Very bleak, but very true. And so one thing that's happened between the height of the movement in the middle of the summer and now is support for Black Lives Matter has declined. On the right-hand side is a poll from the Pew Research Center that found that among all adults, support for Black Lives Matter has declined by more than 10%. Among white adults, by an even higher percentage point. But it's, unsurprisingly still strongly supported by African Americans. So the national story is also true locally. In the middle of the summer, the biggest protest in Maine was, over 2,000 people in June. And that was after George Floyd's lynching by a police officer in Minneapolis. In October, the same group that organized that protest called on its supporters to turn out for a protest in support of Breonna Taylor, and fewer than 400 people showed up. Now, there are many ways you can respond to this. It looks bleak, it looks unfortunate, it looks like the public is fickle and all of that stuff. The two ways that I find help explain why this is happening and what supporters of Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives can do are encapsulated by the terms intersectionality and abeyance. And that's what my next couple of slides are about. So surely you've heard this term. I think conservatives like to throw it around to show how horrible everything is. But it was coined in the late 80s by a legal scholar named Kimberle Crenshaw. And she was working in anti-discrimination law and found that race discrimination law didn't quite work when Black women were faced discrimination in the workplace. Gender discrimination law did the same thing. It didn't quite generate good outcomes for Black women who faced discrimination in the workplace. And so she came up with this critique of anti-discrimination law, which is encapsulated by the term intersectionality. And the term describes two things. On the one hand, it describes the multiple harms that face people who are doubly or trebly or quadruply oppressed. But it also describes why it's easier to pay attention to the pain of a Black man or a white woman than it is to the pain of a Black woman, or a queer Black person, or a Black trans person, or a Black trans femme, or a Black disabled trans femme, and on and on and on. She suggests that our gaze is structured in a way that can compute really only one axis of oppression. And she suggests that our journalists, our academics, and our collective attention struggles to compute violence against people at the intersection of multiple forms of violence. If you want to know more about her ideas, I suggest reading that article or listening to her TED Talk, which is linked here, but I won't actually go into it now. Okay, abeyance is another term. Intersectionality is one abeyance. Abeyance is a term that feminist theorists coined in the late 80s to describe what happened to the women's movement. A lot of critics of the women's movement were saying, it's done, it's over, everything's achieved, the movement is not necessary anymore, and there are no visible manifestations of the movement that we can point to and say, oh, look, there's a march, there's a protest, the women's movement is still alive. Well, movements don't die. That's the basic idea that abeyance points to. Movements instead go into abeyance. And abeyance suggests that although these movements might not be visible on the streets, they work their way through institutions, are alive within submerged networks, within culture, and within everyday living. Verda Taylor, another feminist theorist, wrote in 2013 that abeyance depicts a holding pattern in which a social movement manages to sustain itself and mount a challenge to authorities in a hostile political culture and environment, thereby providing continuity from one stage of mobilization to another. And so I suggested earlier that there was continuity between 2016 and 2020 for Black radical feminism in Maine. The same thing is going to happen between 2020 and the next eruption of mass protests and mass movement in Maine. My guess is same people are going to be involved, or very similar people are going to be involved, people on the receiving end of the most violent structures in our society. And so these movements won't disappear, they just go into abeyance. One lesson that certainly I, as an ACLU worker, am drawing, and perhaps Maine conservation voters, its supporters might benefit from, is when movements go into abeyance, find the movement builders, build relationships with them, both when everyone's doing it and when nobody you know is doing it. There are groups that are run by and that represent impact people in Maine, like Maine Inside Out, which is made up of some formerly incarcerated people. Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition, formerly incarcerated Mainers run that. Southern Maine Workers Center, Black Portland organizers working to end racism, the Wabanaki Alliance, relatively new organization, advocacy arm for the 4 indigenous nations in Maine, Survivors Speak USA, and on. This is a non-exhaustive list. And One way to do that is to practice being a good ally to these groups. And my favorite heuristic for what allyship constitutes is that allyship involves these three A's: answer, adopt, and attribute. And the first is that every organization, every movement has demands and involves a call to action. Answer that call to action by listing your capabilities, both to yourself and to the movement. You know, what can I do? What can I offer? What are my capabilities? And then adopt those demands as your own. And then don't act like you came up with the ideas, attribute the demands. A lot of bridges are burnt between established groups like ours and grassroots organizations when we steal their ideas. And so don't do that. This is my last slide. I just wanted to end on a more uplifting note from the note that I started on, which is to praise Maine conservation voters for supporting probably the biggest bill of this last legislative session, which was LD 2094. LD 2094, an act to implement the recommendations of the task force on changes to the Maine Indian Claim Settlement Act, was the culmination of 6 months of in-depth conversation and compromise between representatives of the indigenous nations in Maine and a bipartisan group of people. The bill ended up getting more hours of hearings than any bill in this past legislative session, became hugely controversial for some factions. The Attorney General and the Governor opposed parts of the bill, but I believe it's at the heart of racial and environmental justice and gender justice in this state. And so I wanted to applaud Maine conservation voters for its decision to put its weight behind this bill. Unfortunately, the fact that the legislative session is not going to restart means this bill will have to be reintroduced in the next legislative session. That concludes my talk. I appreciate Maine conservation voters, Will and Kathleen, for inviting me to speak.
Michael, thank you so much. And thanks for calling out LD 2094. For folks who may not have seen all of our previous Lunch and Learns, we did feature a couple that dug into questions of tribal sovereignty. So you can find those posted on our website and our YouTube page. Michael, we've got a bunch of really good questions. You've given us a lot to think about, but before we get into that, our regulars know that this is the call to action part of the program, and it's not going to surprise anybody that we just have one call to action: vote, 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 vote. If you have already voted, I know a lot of you probably have. Thank you. And we're heading into the final four, as we say, before the big day, and not too late to make sure your friends and family and neighbors and everybody you know has a plan to vote. Got a quick poll here. How did you cast your ballot, or are you waiting for election day? The ACLU of Maine runs a really fabulous voting hotline. And the information is on the screen now. It's also will be in the follow-up email that we share later this afternoon. So if you have any questions, if you see anything that troubles you, pick up the phone, send a text, send an email. We're going to have some great folks online to help answer and navigate that and make sure that everybody gets to vote safely on Tuesday. All right, how are we doing here? Look at that. Big use of the secure drop boxes. That's how I cast my absentee ballot this year, and it was pretty exciting, I gotta say. Thank you so much. We have 100% already voted on this call. You guys are the best. That means you can concentrate on getting others out to vote this this weekend. All right, let's answer some questions. So to kick things off, you mentioned a bill 2094 from the last legislative session. A year before, in 2019, a bill passed through the Maine legislature that allows park rangers at state parks to be trained and authorized to enforce the law, doing things like issuing summons, using self-defense, arresting and detaining people. I'm not sure if it allows park rangers to carry a firearm, but I have a feeling you have some thoughts on that. We're curious.
I have my own thoughts about that, but I'm unfortunately going to have to punt this question because, as I suggested earlier, we have an internal process for deciding what we say about what bill. But
that makes sense.
I think
all right, well, we'll have to talk offline later. Thank you, Michael. So a question about the focus of the Black Lives Matter movement. Isn't class discrimination the most widely felt and widely shared experience, particularly in a state like Maine that's so white? Why doesn't Black Lives Matter focus on that?
That's a great question. I have had this debate for over a decade, and it's a common topic of conversation. Let's focus on class because that's the most important and most widely felt axis of discrimination. The most effective proponent of that perspective that I've come across is a guy named Adolph Reed. I had a slide on him, which I skipped. He wrote a book called Class Notes in the 90s and is a very fierce critic of anti-racism. He's an African-American guy who was very involved in the civil rights movement and the labor movement. And he's given many stump speeches for Bernie, that kind of thing. And so my response is the proof is in the pudding, in the sense that look what happened when Black Lives Matter galvanized millions of people around the country. I mean, I certainly couldn't find a movement this big throughout Maine's history, except maybe the Ku Klux Klan's involvement in Maine politics in the early part of the 20th century. So in the early 20s, there was a rally in Portland of 6,000 people, which is more than twice the number of people who came out for the biggest rally in the middle of and Portland at the time had roughly the same number of people, 68 to 70,000 people. And that movement was a race-based movement. That movement, well, it was more a religion, it was a WASP supremacist movement that targeted Catholics. And so, the two are inextricable, race and class. But what we've seen over the last year is that millions of people care about this issue. And when you read the platform of the Movement for Black Lives, you very quickly learn that these people aren't just anti-racist, they're also anti-capitalist. And they're also pro-queer, they're also feminist, they're also pro-trans, they're also against discrimination against people with disabilities. They're also pro-immigrant, and on and on and on. And though race is emphasized in the slogan and in the title of the movements, their program is very, very multi-class and cuts across different, all different forms of violence.
Thank you. We have a question about that, just how attached we have been through American history to this narrative of spontaneous action. I can remember being taught that, Rosa Parks was just too tired to get up and sit in a different part of the bus. And what do you think, what's behind that? What is, why are we so attached to that spontaneous action? And what sort of harm does that do potentially?
I think even your dog doesn't want that question to be answered. But, as you know, Rosa Parks deliberately sat at the back of the bus she sat on as a part of a intentional, carefully crafted strategy. She was a trained activist. She wasn't just tired and one day decided to. So I think it's multiple reasons. One is a high level of organization and solidarity is inherently threatening to powerful people and institutions. And so it's in the interest of powerful people and institutions to popularize a narrative of spontaneity rather than the true narrative, which is that it's well-organized people who've worked across years and across generations to build social movements and achieve dramatic and lasting changes. I think the idea of spontaneity is also one that journalism kind of unwittingly perpetuates, because there's a dominant model of journalism that doesn't depend on building and sustaining deep relationships with people who are most marginalized. There's a dominant model of journalism where you just go to the big thing that's happening and you write about it from your journalist's perspective. And if you don't know who organized this thing, if you don't know how many years they've been at it, if you don't know what their relationships are, what their organizational structure is, then you're likely to paint the event in terms of spontaneity. And the first draft of history is journalism, and I think that's a lot of where it comes from.
That's really interesting. Thank you. We have another question about the data that you shared about the use of force in the Portland Police Department, particularly. Connecting that dot to the sort of misallocation of resources is one of the most effective cases for defunding the police that I've heard. Is that something that's being used sort of broadly in the defund the police conversations, or would we see? Do you have a sense of whether we'd see similar data if we looked at in other jurisdictions?
It is truly mind-boggling how similar the data is across jurisdictions. The Defund Police slogan grew out of the experience of Black and Brown communities throughout the country and Indigenous communities. In cities like Ferguson and New York and Los Angeles. But even in cities that are mostly white, even in a place like South Portland or Westbrook or Portland, when you do what police call a workload analysis, you find out how much time they spend, how many of the calls result in a use of force. You keep encountering the same story. Fewer than 4% of calls to police result in arrests, and less than a fifth of a percentage point result in a use of force. A prominent national critic of policing, Alex Vitale, who wrote End of Policing, marshals similar statistics for other jurisdictions. And local activists all throughout the country are doing exactly the same thing. And yeah, I've compared numbers throughout Maine, and they're very, very similar. Municipality.
It's really fascinating. Do you happen to know where you mentioned Rockland, have other jurisdictions proposed defunding the police in that same kind of process?
The only petition I know of is in Rockland, but certainly there's been lots of public testimony in Maine throughout municipalities to that effect.
All right. Let's see, we've got a couple more questions here. you shared so many great resources and such a sort of academic understanding of this as well as a on the ground. Do you have a top couple of reading list recommendations for folks, or where could we go to find those?
Most terrifying question of all. What's the top book? What's the one book? Well, for shorter piece, for journalism, I recommend Miriam Kaba's article in the New York Times, which came out this summer. I suppose, no, there's an easy answer to that question. The ACLU has compiled a reading list. You can go to our website and...
See, you do have a good, that's good.
Yeah.
Perfect. We'll start there. All right. Other questions, keep them coming. So about your research, what kind of academic background do you have on this work?
That's an interesting question. I focused on criminal law when I was a law student. When I clerked for the Supreme Court of Maine, that's what brought me to Maine, clerkship for Chief Justice Softly, who is the previous Chief Justice of Maine. About a third of the cases that I worked on were criminal law cases. I have spent, actually, I did a master's degree after law school and spent a fair bit of time studying the way the Ethiopian government treats Ethiopian Muslims by studying official Islamic institutions in Ethiopia. And I found very similar parallels between the two societies. And I suppose I like reading about this stuff. I've conducted reading groups for books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, and Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, and other such books.
Sounds like pretty fascinating reading groups to be part of. I would love to to join you. Good.
Yeah, I will add, the thing actually that's been most educational, frankly, is working with people that are the worst impacted by the system. So 2 years ago, I facilitated a book club in Cumberland County Jail for veterans who've been accused of sex crimes. So it's a very specific group of people whom this society is quite eager to just throw away, just to forget, lock them up, throw the key away. And if we can't find a way to heal, reintegrate, rehabilitate such people, then we're not really abolitionists, except in the most academic and performative sense of the term. And so, spending 2 hours a week in Cumberland County Jail, reading a text with these folks was, I found, insanely educational, just incredibly educational.
What did you read?
We read Homer. And
wow.
We read lots of short stories by veterans. We read Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. We read poetry. I don't know if I said that. It was, it was an incredibly meaningful experience, I think, for all of us.
Sounds like, thank you. My dog is really enjoying this program. I'm sorry. Michael, you clearly have a really deep understanding of movements and movement building. And I wonder if you think about Maine, where's the greatest area for growth particularly in our environmental movement? Sorry.
I didn't hear what you said after the greatest. So maybe you can type it in to me.
The greatest area for growth, in particular with the environmental movement. I'm very used to Sirius Black the dog's barking at this point, so we're good. Yeah.
I think Maine could really benefit from an Ella Baker that connects Indigenous rights to what's happening in South Portland with the oil tanks there, to the Black Lives Matter activists throughout the state. I think that, and to the conservationists who pay dues to this organization, belong to this organization, and so on. I think that a mass environmental movement that connects those things, and a group or an institution or a person to connect those things would help to supercharge the movement here.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if you heard from us for some some help. Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing just fascinating information and thinking. I'm really grateful, and so grateful to everybody who joined today. We will send out a survey later this afternoon. We really welcome your feedback, so please take a few moments to fill it out. And the email that goes out with that survey will include the ACLU's voter protection hotline information. It's hard to believe, you guys, but by next Friday, when we gather for next week's Lunch and Learn, it will be post-election, and we will be teaming up with folks from the League of Women Voters of Maine for a post-election roundtable discussion. What we saw, what we learned, what changes we see on the horizon. I have no idea what we'll be talking about, but it is going to be fascinating, and I'm really grateful to everybody who joined us today. We will see you next week. Michael, thanks a million. It was really great to talk with you today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Michael.